Welcome to this week's message from Anthem Church. We're so glad you're joining us online today. Our prayer is that this message encourages you, strengthens your faith, and helps you take your next step in following Jesus.
J.D. Rockefeller. Some of you know his name. Those that are maybe a little bit younger or don't study history or not in the finance world might not know his name. I'll tell you who he was. He was, at the time, the wealthiest man that lived when he was in his heyday, J.D. Rockefeller. And when he died, an inquisitive human being went to his accountant, who knew J.D. Rockefeller's accountant, and said, can you tell me how much he left behind? And the accountant said, all of it. Okay, for those, I'll say that one more time, because I know sometimes we got to allow our brains to catch up with all of that. J.D. Rockefeller, an insanely wealthy guy. It's the Elon Musk of today, right? The Elon Musk of yesteryear. Died. And somebody went to his accountant and just said, how much did he leave? They had inquisitive, was it X amount of billion, a trillion, who knows? Although they say Elon Musk is going to be the first trillionaire, so it wasn't that. But how much did he leave? All of it. What a great response from the accountant. I don't know if the accountant had a faith. I don't know if he knew Jesus. But what a beautiful response to help order a man's heart. And maybe there was a little bit of I want to be jealous around how much he had in his bank account. And I think that so perfectly fits the series that we've been talking around. And so if you are here for the first time, you have come in a finance series, but today's going to be a little different, just by the way. But you've come in once a year, we teach on finances for a couple of weeks, because we believe that Jesus came that we may have freedom and life. And one of the areas that needs to be set free is our financial stewardship, because by a show of hands at the beginning of this series, vast majority of us live under financial stress, which is not the way God has designed us to be. But in this series, we have been looking at the patterns of God, and we're going. But today I want to tell you, I'm going to go through some of my notes. But just last night, as I was just finalizing, I really felt like God put a prophetic burden on me for us as a community. And then this morning, I was like, God, the prophetic burden is something I want more clarity before I just stand up and say something from the front, you know. And I just could not shake what the Spirit of God was saying. And so we're going to get to that. It is unformed, not unreformed, it's unformed within me. But what I'm trusting will come across is that the Spirit of God, you'll hear the burden of the Spirit of God to us as Anthem Church in this time. But we're going to go through some notes. But the real point of today is going to take place in 10 minutes time. Is that okay? So as we've been in this series, we've been looking at how we can order our finances in such a way that we can experience the life that God has intended for us. We've looked, and so I just want to do a quick recap, and then one thing for today before we get into the prophetic burden. But the first, if you remember, the first week was this: remember the seed. Remember the seed. God is our source. And in that seed, every rand that comes into our hands, God has so perfectly designed that there is bread for today and seed for tomorrow. So in every rand, our responsibility is to go, we're not to consume it all today, and we're not to save the whole thing for tomorrow. There is sustenance and future harvest in every seed. God is the source, the power of the seed. That was the first sermon. Again, get onto the Church Center app. You got the notes, the messages. You can go and have a look at that. And so the application out of the first sermon was, what's in my hand now, and how am I to steward this? And what part of it is to go into the ground so that it may be a future harvest. And that could be a personal future harvest. It could be my own generational future harvest. It can be an eternal harvest. All of those things are up for grabs. The second thing we spoke around was the procedure of God, if you remember that God had a procedure for our finances, and we spoke specifically about the disposition that we're to carry into our finances. It's one thing to know that we should be doing this practically, like we should tithe, or we should save, we should do all of that, but it's the disposition that we need to hold for the power, if you remember the title, the power-releasing pattern of God. So if we want then not just to be the pattern of God, but the power release, then we have to have a disposition that we hold to. And so just very, very briefly, we looked at the purpose of how we steward our finances, and it's worship, and it's mission, and it's justice, and it's unity. We looked at the procedure, regular, universal, it means it's for everybody. Proportional, it's in keeping with our income. God doesn't expect us to go into debt to fund the kingdom. Prepared, that we would pay attention to how we order our finances, that we can be prepared to give. But then the disposition was the key of this message. And so these were the 4 things, just to remind us that we are stewards, not owners. Everything is God's. We just have to steward it when it comes into our hands. And what that does is it determines who is sovereign in our lives. The tithe as a principle, not under the law. Jesus came to fulfill the law. So we don't tithe as a law. We tithe as a principle of first fruits to God. There's a different motive behind that. The third thing is generous as opposed to self-serving. And the fourth is willing as opposed to under compulsion. I love the fact that God gives us freedom to give or not to give. But here's the deal. Who loves going out with a stingy person? I think it's safe to say that God also doesn't really like to hang out with stingy people. I'm not saying that you're not saved. I'm not saying that you're not going to be with Him in heaven. But there's something about a generosity of our heart and spirit which is attractive to one another, that we want to hang out with one another. And I think our Father in heaven is the same. So we want to be willing, not under compulsion. Last week, we looked at the pattern of God. And we looked at these 4 things, that stewarding, that we are, the sovereignty decision, the first belongs to God. What stewarding does with our tithe, the first fruits, is it declares, it reminds us that Jesus is King, that God is Father, that He is sovereign, not ourselves. And as we give it to Him as a first fruits offering, it reminds us of our place, and actually that God is more able to redeem the 90% that's left than the 100% in our own hands. Seeding, your harvest forerunner. We spoke around this, that how many people get on in their lives and they desire to have a harvest of something, but they forgot to put seed in the ground a year ago or 2 years ago or 5 years ago. And so we stand here and we're watching all our friends reap a harvest of their financial stewardship, and we're empty-handed because we forgot that in every rand there's part seed for a future harvest. Then there's saving, and we looked at that as your generational investment plan, that we can give to our 2 generations from now. They can be trust fund kids. I mean, who doesn't want to be a trust fund kid? Who wishes that their work could be something that they chose to do, whether they got paid for it or not? I mean, how delightful will that be? Well, we can give to a couple of generations from us that same desire and dream that we longed for ourselves, because it's in God's pattern. And then spending your daily provision. So how do we spend what's given to us? And we looked very briefly again. These aren't laws. These are practices that can come. And so what's helpful would be a 10% tithe as a stewarding option, 10% seed for a future harvest, 10% towards saving, and 70% towards living. That is not rules. It's just helpful for a practice to give to you. Today, before we get to the prophetic burden, the message of today was this: from seed to legacy. So we started this journey of seed and the power of seed. But we've got to know that the seed is for legacy. The seed is to create a tree that somebody can climb and encounter Jesus. Whether that's our retirement, whether that's our children, whether that's our community, whether that's our nation. We want our seed. We want the way we handle our finances to have legacy effect that can live beyond us. Why? Because like J.D. Rockefeller, when we die, it's all left behind. So let's make it count. This is God's pattern. And so within legacy, turning seed into legacy has 2 elements to it. And I think this is what God teaches us in the scriptures. There's both an earthly legacy as well as a heavenly legacy. And so when we're managing that seed that comes into our hand, there's both provision for today and seed for tomorrow. And that seed for tomorrow is both for what's here on earth and for what's in eternity. And so our responsibility increases. It's another layer down. And we see in Proverbs 13:22, and we looked at this last week or the week before, I forget. Proverbs 13:22, a good man leaves an inheritance for his children's children. And that man is humanity. It's not man as in gender male. So who wants to be a good human? Like we all want to be a good human. And so God says a good human leaves an inheritance for his children's children. So there's something of converting our seed into legacy here on earth for 2 generations from me. Which is why 2 generations, that's why we say we can have trust fund kids. 2 generations from me. How beautiful is that? And I think sometimes what we do is I'm not earning enough, that trust fund's not going to be anything. I tell you guys, if you... Shucks, I've just had a complete blank on the book I'm reading. The Psychology of Money. Thank you. Go and read The Psychology of Money and the compounding effect. And if we just put in a few small rands today, what that can be in 2 generations. We have the ability to build wealth because of God's pattern. Psychology of Money, great book. So there's a living for a legacy that is in our lifetime or beyond our lifetime here on earth. But then the greater one, and this ties into the prophetic burden that I'm having, and I'm going to get into that in just a second, is investing in eternity. So a legacy for eternity. And Jesus, when he starts his ministry, and we read this in Matthew chapter 5 to 7, Matthew chapter 5 to 7, we see Jesus begin his public ministry. And somebody asks him right up front and says, so have you come to abolish the law? Have you come to abolish kind of the Old Testament stuff that Israel was taught? And Jesus says, I haven't come to abolish it, I've come to fulfill it. There's a difference. And so there are certain things that we could never attain to. We could never attain to perfection in righteousness. And Jesus came to fulfill that for us. So there are some things, but he also didn't come to abolish the principles that God was establishing through the 10 Commandments and through the instructions that he gave to Israel. He didn't come to abolish that. He came to fulfill it through his son Jesus to help us to understand how to place it. And then what Jesus does in Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7 is he kind of takes the formation of Israel, the 10 Commandments, plus a few, like the other things that God said, and he puts it into modern day language. He puts it into what the people could understand in their day. And we read that in those. So you go and have a look at them again. But one of them, he comes to this point in Matthew chapter 5, and he says this, if anyone sets aside, wait, let me read it from here. Truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. And then he goes on to say, this is what you must practice and teach. And so we jump into Matthew chapter 6, verse 19 to 24. And it says, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. We skip 2 verses, and then we pick it up in verse 24. No one can serve 2 masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. So this is how Jesus starts his ministry. And effectively, so he's talking about money here, but it's this thing of like, you can't have an idol before God himself. You cannot serve God and you be on the throne. You cannot serve God and have your spouse on the throne. You cannot serve God and have your position in your company on the throne. You cannot serve God and have your children on the throne. You cannot have God and money on the throne. But what Jesus is starting to say is that we've got to link our giving, link our stewarding of our finances to eternal outcomes. And so now we've got to reorientate. Okay, so how much of my giving is for earthly outcomes and how much is for eternal outcomes? We've got to start to do the maths here. We've got to allow the Spirit of God to shape us. And then Jesus says this at the end of his ministry. And here's my real prophetic burden. So this could come out a little bit raw. It could, but I'm trusting you get the spirit with which I say this. In Luke chapter 14, Jesus is talking about the time that he will return to be with humanity. And we know that in the scriptures, the church is called the bride of Christ, that Jesus is returning for the bride. And so, surprise, surprise, men, if you didn't know that, you're going to be a bride wearing a white dress one day. And so we've got to somehow find our way around that. But it somehow is righteous and holy. Let's not get distracted. So we have this moment where there's going to be this wedding feast with Jesus and his bride. And somebody says to Jesus, because Jesus talks about this, and someone says to Jesus, "Oh, how beautiful it must be to be at that wedding feast." Luke chapter 14, you can go and read it. How beautiful it must be to be at that wedding feast. And then Jesus says this, well, it is a beautiful wedding feast, and the Father has prepared it for his Son to have his bride. But this is what happens. At the time, the Father sends out the servants to go to all those that are invited, that have received their invitation. And as the servant goes to the one, that guy says, "Oh, sorry, I've just bought a field. I'm going to go and check on it." Then the servant goes to the next guy, and the next guy that received the invitation says, "Sorry, I've just bought 5 yoke of oxen. I need to go and check on them, put them to work." Then he goes to the next guy, and the next guy says, "Sorry, I've just got married. I'm not coming with you to the wedding banquet." And so the servant goes back to the father of the house who's thrown this wedding banquet for his son, Jesus Christ, and his bride, and says, all these people that had received invitations, they all have excuses not to come. And the father gets angry and says, well, then go out to everywhere and go and get the poor and the broken and the lame and the needy. Bring them in. I felt like God say, Rich, would you be so brave to stand up and say to the church, you can follow the patterns of God. You can receive the blessing of God. A field was a blessing from God. 5 yoke of oxen to perform business was a blessing from God. A marriage partner is a blessing from God. All of these are gifts from God, and yet they disqualified themselves from sitting at the wedding banquet. So there is something in that, friends, that I can preach this entire finance series, and I tell you now that if you follow the pattern of God, it will go well with your finances. But that's not the point. The point is that we would be sitting at the wedding feast when Jesus returns. And we have some decisions to make. And have we allowed, for some of us, the blessings of God to get in the way of our love for God? Have we allowed our spouses a gift? God says it's not good that man should be alone, and I give you somebody so that you can experience love, you can know love. Our spouses are gifts from God, but we can put them in the place of an idol. You cannot serve both God and ... And I feel like the Spirit of God would say to us today, what have you heard in these messages for the last 4 weeks? There is an urgency. The earth has gone mad. The last 2 weeks, as a pastor, have been very challenging. We have Israel sending 15 F-35s, 10 of them released munitions on one house. Can I tell you this? It's quite scary for Jax and me, because when we go, it's 200 meters from the church that we go to minister at, and when we park, we can't park outside the front door of the church in case of exposure, so we park 200 meters down the road. We know the house that got taken out. We park opposite it when we go to Doha. And we've always commented on the high security of that house. It got taken out by 10 F-35s dropping munitions, targeted missiles on it. Like, we know that. I've walked there on that pavement. Then a 23-year-old Ukrainian gets stabbed on a subway. Then Charlie Kirk gets assassinated for having an opinion. At something that's not even commanded over people, it's voluntary. Like, you can be there or not be there. If you disagree with them, just don't be there. Something has shifted. And Jesus is saying, what are we going to do? So when we're starting to talk to people about Charlie Kirk, are they going to find our opinions, or are they going to find Jesus? When we talk about a 23-year-old Ukrainian woman on a train that got stabbed, are they going to find our opinion, or are they going to find Jesus? When we talk about Israel and Doha and Hamas and 5 leaders in a house and should they have done it, shouldn't they have done it? Are they going to find our opinion or are they going to find Jesus? Because our Father says He's preparing a house and He's preparing a wedding feast for the Son to come to collect His bride. Are we infatuated with the bride or are we infatuated with the good gifts that God has given to us, the field and the 5 yoke of oxen and our spouse? I feel like the Spirit of God is just saying, church, please, please, let's not serve God and. Let's not serve God and. Jesus did not die for us so that we could serve God and have our opinions. We died to ourselves. That's what being saved means. We died to ourselves and we were rescued by Jesus. The church in the US has been rattled by Charlie Kirk. Rattled. And we'll see what comes out of it. But I think what is part of what has been shaken is they've understood that the foundation of what they've been built on has maybe been a bit shaky. Maybe there's too much politics in it. I don't know. Maybe there's too much. I don't know. And it's a matter of time before something like Charlie Kirk happens in South Africa, the South African version, and what's going to be found in our lives. And I feel like the Spirit of God, in a sense, this is going to sound so weird, as I say, this is unformed in my head, but the Spirit of God as the servant of God, He is God Himself. So please, it's not a theology, but I just feel like the Spirit of God is coming out to His church and saying the invitation, the invitation, the invitation, and what are we doing with that invitation? What are we doing with that invitation? And there's a cry in the heart of the Father to say, can we not store up for ourselves treasures on earth? We cannot serve 2 masters, friends. Our financial stewardship, our physical stewardship, our relational stewardship, everything, can that seed be planted in the direction of eternity? Can we invest in eternity? Can every decision be made with eternity in mind? Can every decision be made with the wedding banquet in mind? Can every decision be made with the groom, Jesus Christ, in mind? We're going to have communion today. John's going to be leading us in communion, but I just want to preface it with this. I think there's an opportunity for us. I think in some respect, the Spirit of God is just going before, that we would be prepared, that we're getting a reminder of the invitation that we've received, a reminder of the invitation that some of us in this room have already accepted. But the time is still ahead, and I think it's a reminder for us to get on our knees, whether you do that physically or just in your heart, that's up to you. But I think there's a moment where God is saying, who else is God in your life? Who else is God? Who's got your attention more than our Father in heaven? Who's got your concern more than our Father in heaven? Who?
Thank you for watching today's message. If you'd like to take your next step with us, get connected, or find out more about Anthem, visit our website or reach out through the Church Center app. We'd love to walk the journey with you.